We're now on the second last cluster of the various elements of the 48 paths that are required in order for a person to acquire Torah. So the second last cluster is going to come back to things that we're supposed to be doing, because we've spoken about in the last section what we're supposed to think about and invest in other people. Now we're coming back to what we have to do on our own. And you'll see how they pretty much, they align with each other. They'll go, in a sense, I suppose, as a continuum. So what are the features of this next cluster? Number one, which, according to all of the commentaries, means that a person is supposed to be patient and deliberate in the way that they learn Torah. So we'll come back to that in a second. Then, and this, by the way, is really important information, shoyel umeshiv. You have to be willing to ask questions, and you have to be ready to provide answers in order to be able to learn Torah. In addition to that, shomeya umoisif. You have to be listening and adding to the Torah. Now, you've got to be very careful with that expression, adding to the Torah, because it could be misconstrued. And then he says, Haloimed al menas lelamed. That's one of the keys to being able to acquire Torah, is to learn Torah with the objective of teaching. And Haloimed al menas lasois, and learning in order to be able to do. Okay, so we have to see what the flow and the link is between these things. Clearly, they're all advice to us about how we're supposed to learn. And to be honest, even if you haven't mastered the preceding 40-odd traits of how to acquire Torah, it's probably a good idea to use these ASAP, as soon as you can, because these are really good ones. Not that the others are not, but I'm saying these are kind of accessible. So the first thing he says is misyashev liboy b'talmudai, that a person is supposed to be deliberate in the way that they go about learning, which means that you're not supposed to rush to a conclusion. And in today's world, where everybody's always in a rush, and everybody's always off to the next thing, I don't know if you've ever heard this expression, but there are people who, in a shiur, might say to the rabbi, I've heard this in this context, say to the rabbi, you need to land the plane. Have you ever heard that expression? You have to land the plane. And basically what that means is, get to the point already. You've pontificated long enough, you've gone on and on and on and on, now it's time to actually get a tachlis, what's this all about? And in our highly impatient world, not only impatient because everybody's under a lot of pressure, but also because we live in an instant gratification world where we believe that it is completely normal just to be able to get a download or microwave a meal or find the summarized version. So we're losing the ability to be misyashev liboy b'talmudai, to invest in time and in patience in the things that we're learning. And this is exactly what he's telling us. If a person wants to acquire Torah, they need to know that this is not a rush job. It doesn't work that way. Anybody who's studied Gemara will be very familiar with this, because the style and nature of Gemara is that way. You can't rush through a Gemara. It just doesn't work. You can't just knock it off, because it's designed to tantalize, to challenge, to get us to think, to make us compare, to do research. Very, very often, in order to understand one piece of the Gemara, you have to actually pull out another Gemara from a different topic to have the context that you need in order to be able to understand this piece of the Gemara, which, by the way, is a theme that we're going to talk about a little bit later in one of the other phrases that we've just used. We'll come back to the same theme. But the idea is, misyashev liboy b'talmudai, a person has to recognize that you've got to give this time, you've got to be patient, otherwise a person cannot truly acquire Torah. Remember that the objective of this chapter generally, and this Mishnah specifically, is to be able to acquire Torah. That doesn't just mean to learn things or to be able to complete books. Those people who maybe read a book a week, it's very nice, but it doesn't mean that you've acquired it. It doesn't mean that it's yours. It doesn't mean that you've actually onboarded all of the information. Whereas when it comes to Torah, where the objective is that we want it really to be ours, then it's important, misyashev liboy b'talmudai, that a person is very patient and invested in the learning that they're doing. But then he says something incredibly interesting, which is shoyel umeshiv. That if a person wants to acquire Torah, then what's really important is to be able to ask questions and to be able to answer questions, which seems a little contradictory, don't you think? Because some of us are in a position to ask and some of us are in a position to answer. And it might also depend on what the topic is. There's certain topics that we don't feel confident or knowledgeable enough to be able to answer, and other topics where we feel too confident to ask. Or, like I know the subject already. So what's he telling us over here when he speaks about asking and answering? And what you're going to see as a theme throughout all of the things that we're learning today is that in order for a person to acquire Torah, there has to be clarity. And that's why if a person is going to learn Torah, misyashev liboy, the person has to be patient about it, because we don't know if we're going to get clarity when we rush through things and want to get to the conclusion as soon as possible. Whereas when we take our time and we get involved in the conversation and the research behind it, then there's a greater chance that we'll have clarity. And it's exactly the same thing with questions as well. That if a person doesn't ask questions, how will they ever have clarity? Very often we sit in a group and we're learning in a group, and there are questions that come up for us. And then we don't feel that we want to ask the question, either because we're concerned maybe somebody will look at us and say, well, that was already... that was a dumb question. Why did you even ask that? Or because we're worried that it might be a little bit off the topic. And as we shall see in just a moment, it's not only about asking questions, it's also about knowing how to ask questions, which is really important. So we'll come to that in a moment. But the fact is that very often people end up not asking the questions that they really should ask for whatever reasons. They're afraid of being seen to be stupid, or being embarrassed because they asked a question was an obvious question, or whatever the case is. So that's why it's encouraging our shoyl that we have to ask questions. The question is, how do you ask a question? Right? Because you get different kinds of people and you get different kinds of questions. And some questions are really valuable and some questions, unfortunately, are completely counterproductive. So for example, in the best case, we have an expression that we say that shailas chacham, the question of a wise person, chatzi tshuva, is already half the answer. Because they're smart enough that the way that they phrase the question already gives you insight and already helps you to understand the direction that you should be going in order to understand this topic. And that's a great challenge for us. We want to try as best as we can to ask shailos chacham. We want to ask wise questions, ideally, right? As much as we possibly can. Now, you don't always know if your question is a wise question or not, because sometimes it's just, this is what's on my mind, and I don't know what everybody else is going to think about it. So how do you know if you're asking a question that is an appropriate question or that is a good question? That's a valuable thing to think about. How do we know when a question is a valid or helpful question? I don't know, anybody got any ideas? I'll ask the question. Because remember, it says shoyl u'meishiv, if you have to ask and answer, so I'll ask the question, you can answer. What would you say are the symptoms or the signs of a healthy or helpful question? See, now that was a good question, right? It's a good question. Clearly wasn't a question of a chacham, because then we would have already had half the answer. So what are the signs of a good question? Well, let's start firstly with what's the sign of a bad question, because if we can eliminate those, then we can understand what a good question is. The Gemara talks about the idea that when you're learning a particular subject, you should not raise a question on an unrelated subject. Now that might sound quite obvious, right? Because this is what we're learning about. The reality is, unfortunately, it's not always that obvious. And that's the kind of question which becomes counterproductive, because we're trying to understand and clarify this particular topic. And if you go off onto a completely different topic, number one, it might actually confuse the teacher, because the teacher is not invested mentally at that point in that topic. And that's going to throw the teacher off course and say, oh my gosh, now what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to answer this question, and I don't have the resources at my fingertips. And that could derail the entire process of whatever you're supposed to be learning. The other thing is that if a person asks a question that's off the topic, then the people who are involved in the study, the other participants in the learning, they'll now get distracted and they might start thinking about that other topic which is unrelated. And then if the teacher is able to refocus and continue going, there might be people who are left behind because they've now started thinking about this other topic. So one of the key things is to ask a question that is relevant. You might remember in the fifth chapter, when we learned about the 7 indicators of a wise person and the 7 indicators of a fool, the first thing we said about a wise person is that they ask appropriate questions. So we're circling back to that over here. We're saying, just remember that you ask appropriate questions, meaning to say questions that are aligned with the topic. Then, when it comes to questions, we also get two kinds of questions. Anybody who's learned Gemara will know that in Gemara we identify that there's a kind of question that is called a shaila, and there's a kind of question that we call a kashya. What's the difference between a shaila and a kashya? So this is a shaila. Who do you ask shailas to typically? Rabbi. To the rabbi, right? So why do you ask a shaila? What's the purpose of asking a shaila? Because you want to learn. You want to know what's the halacha. You want to understand practically what you're supposed to do. That's the goal of a shaila. So in other words, a question seeks an answer. And therefore a question is coming from a place of humility and curiosity. I'm humble enough to accept the answer, and I'm curious because I want to know what the answer actually is. That's a shaila. What is a kashya? A kashya means?
Something involved.
So what's the root of the word kashya? Kasher, right? Which means difficult. So in other words, this is a question that is not looking for an answer. This is a question that's looking to discredit what the other person has said. So in the Gemara, when you have two sages who disagree about how you interpret, let's say, a pasuk in the Torah and how you apply it in practical Jewish law, so the one will challenge the other with a kashya to say, well, the way that you've taught, how do you deal with either this reference or this logical conundrum? So the purpose of a kashya is to dismantle the position that somebody else has put forward. Here, he's telling us specifically it needs to be shoyel, not makshe. If a person wants to learn, then the type of questions that we ask have to be questions that are humble and curious, where we actually want to hear an answer, not the kind of question where we're just laying a particular foundation for a position that we want to take, and then we want to be able to either disprove what the other person has said or show them up to say, well, you see, now how are you going to deal with X and Y? And very often when you engage with people in conversation and when you engage in debate, you can identify the difference between a shaila and a kashya, because a shaila is satisfied with an answer, whereas a kashya is frustrated with an answer. I didn't want you to be able to resolve this. I wanted to be able to show you up. I wanted to be able to discredit your opinion.
When you're learning Gemara, there is a type of kashya type relationship. Even though you're not really trying to discredit, you are questioning to get to the bottom of an answer.
Okay, so again, in Gemara, let's be very clear about the difference between the sages in the Gemara and how they debate it versus how we learn Gemara. We don't have the right or the authority to ask a kasha when we're learning Gemara, because we have to acknowledge that the information that is within the Gemara is far superior to anything we'll ever understand. These are great sages that are at a totally different level that we can't even imagine. And therefore, all we can afford to do is ask shailas to say, I don't understand this particular debate, etc. Within the Gemara itself, because they were weeding out the various ways that people could mislearn the Torah, that's what you have room for a kasha. We could say, now that doesn't make sense, and therefore we're going to remove it from how we learn Torah or how we apply this in practice. So suffice it to say that the kashyas between the sages of the Gemara were never intended, God forbid, to disarm or dismantle or discredit the other person's opinion. It was purely to show the emes, the truth of how Torah is actually supposed to apply. So it's really, really important for us. And you can tell very often just from the body language or from the word usage that people have when they ask a question, you could tell if their question wants resolution or if the question is to stir up dissonance or discord. Okay, so you can really pay attention to it. That's what he's telling us. Shoyel, that it's really important for a person to ask questions, but those questions have to be appropriate. And also what he's telling us is that if a person has a question and they don't ask it, they shouldn't expect to be able to acquire Torah. Because in order to gain clarity, remember the theme of this cluster is about gaining clarity. So in order to gain clarity, you have to address the questions that are in your head, because if you don't, how can you have the clarity? So shoyel, it's really important to ask those questions. That is, if you're on the side of the equation where you're trying to clarify. In other words, where you're the student, you're trying to learn, whether it's a student of a book or whether it's the student of a teacher. However, if you're on the other side of the equation, then you have an equal responsibility, meishiv. You have a responsibility to clarify for people. So if you don't have the answer at your fingertips, then it's your responsibility to go back and to do the research and to come back with the answer so that the student has the clarity. Because in order to acquire Torah, we need to have the clarity. And it is a responsibility both of the student and of the teacher to arrive at that clarity. So if the student has the responsibility to ask the question, the teacher has the responsibility to find a way to answer the question, even if that's not immediately available to them. So that's Shoel Umeshiv, the two go hand in hand. You need to have both these factors in order to be able to understand Torah properly. But then he says something very interesting. Shomea, that's obvious, you have to listen. We understand that in Hebrew there are various words for listen. There's lahazin, there's lahakshiv, but here we're using the word shomea. Shomea is to listen with intent and to listen with intellect, like Shema Yisrael, which is that we should contemplate the idea that Hashem is one, not just simply listen to the words, we should actually contemplate the idea. So over here also shomea means to listen with focus, with intention, and with intellect to what we're being taught. Not just, as they say in the classics, in one ear and out the other. Or one of the most common things that happens in the classroom, and anybody who's spent time in the classroom will attest to this, is where you notice that there's a student who's not really paying attention. And then you say, have you been listening to anything that I've said? And they say, yes. And then they parrot back to you what you've just said immediately prior to stopping them and harassing them. And that to them seems to vindicate. Look at me, I was listening. I can even tell you the words that you've just said. But we know that that is something which we call echoic memory, which effectively just means that they heard the words in their subconscious and they're able to spit those words back at you. But 20 minutes from now, they'll have zero recollection of anything because they weren't shomea, they weren't actually listening. You might have this experience at home as well with members of the family. We don't want to get overly personal, but I once had a guy tell me that he can't understand why his wife started a conversation in such a strange way. She started the conversation by saying, have you been listening to anything I've said? So, we understand that shomea means to listen with intent, and that's what he's telling us over here. In order to be able to learn, we have to listen with intention, which means, besides anything else on a really practical level, we have to define for ourselves what is our best listening mode. Some people listen best when they take notes. Some people listen best when there's no distraction. Some people listen best when they're doing something that keeps them occupied. You actually have to be aware of that so that you know how to maximize the opportunity, shomea, to be able to listen to what's being said. But what's far more interesting is that he says shomea umoisif, that you're supposed to listen and add. The question is, what does that mean? What does it mean to add? If you're talking about the person who's teaching, then it makes sense to say add. Because the person who's teaching surely should add in as much detail as possible, as many examples, all the things that will clarify for somebody how they should understand things, right? That's what you'd expect. But here we're talking about the shomea. We're talking about the person who's listening. Why is it that the person who's listening is the person who should be adding? Now, just before we jump into this, I just want to throw out a concept which I think is very useful to understand. And that is, would you say, think about this for a moment, would you say that the sign of a person who really knows their subject matter is their ability to be concise or their ability to be complex? Concise. Now everybody jumped at that, right? Why? See, the trap of every Jewish or Torah-related question is that the answer to every single question should always start with, it depends. And it does depend. I'll tell you why. A really good teacher has the art of being concise. Because if a really good teacher who understands the material thoroughly is going to walk into a room of people who don't understand the material that well and spill out all the complexity, they're just going to overwhelm the audience. So the value of a great teacher who really knows their stuff is to be able to be concise. But if that same teacher, now after they've finished their teaching hours, goes to study with somebody of their caliber, then when they study together, is the objective to be concise or complex? So it depends on the circumstances, right? If it's the person with greater knowledge sharing with the person with lesser knowledge, then they should be as concise and succinct as possible to the benefit of the recipient. But when they're developing their own learning with somebody else of their caliber, what we call chavrusa, which is basically somebody who is an intellectual or spiritual peer, then you want to do the opposite of being concise. You want to thrash it out in as much detail as possible, with as many sources as possible, with as many layers to the idea as possible, so that you fully understand. That is moisif. That's what we're talking about over here when we say that the objective is to add to the learning that you've already done. Now, this moisif happens in two ways. It happens in one way to the teacher and in a different way to the student. To the teacher should never walk out of a classroom and say, wow, I have mastered the subject. How do I know? Because look, everybody was eating out of my hand and they loved what I had to say and they claimed that they understood it. So there we go. I'm clearly a master. I don't have to study further in this particular area. That would be a critical mistake because we know that the Torah is infinite. And as soon as they go back to their own studies, they have to be moisif. They have to now learn further. They have to relearn the material at a deeper level, at a more complex level. They dare not be satisfied with what was good enough to teach at level X. We're always supposed to be growing. But the truth is, the same applies to the students. The students could walk out of that class and say, that was amazing. I'm so privileged to have the opportunity to learn that material from that particular teacher. And now this is as good as it gets because I sat there taking in all the material. I have copious notes to prove it. And I've memorized what the teacher said. Great. I'm going to wait until the next year, next week. So what does he say? Shomeya umoisif. What we're supposed to do is once we've learned something, once we've understood something, then we're supposed to go back and add more to what we've already learned, which means two things. We should add the time that we spend on that material because reviewing material is critical. Unfortunately, very often we don't review our material and we're quite satisfied. I remember once in yeshiva, there was a rabbi who said in a cynical moment that all of our notebooks are going to Gan Eden. All of our notebooks are going to Gan Eden because all the knowledge is in the notebooks. But really what we're supposed to do is review the information. And if we review moisif, we add the amount of time that we learn the same material that consolidates the material, which is what we're speaking about over here, clarity and acquiring Torah. That when a person reviews something, that's when they actually acquire it. But in addition to that, what we're supposed to do, there's an expression from Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, who writes in Mishlei, Tein lechacham veyechkam oid. Give material to a wise person and they will become even wiser from the material. Which means that a wise person would see what they have learned as a foundation on which to build further learning. Rather than just to say, we've done that, we can check that box and say, we've finished that particular section, and now we're ready for the next topic. So Shomea or Mosif is incredibly valuable information to understand that our objective is to add to the Torah that we are learning. There's another principle as well, and this goes back to something I mentioned earlier in this year, and that is Divrei Torah. The Gemara uses an expression, Divrei Torah aniyim b'mokom echad va'ashirim b'mokom acher, that the words of Torah are quote-unquote poor in one area and quote-unquote rich in a different area, which means in certain sections, we might speak briefly about a topic that is discussed in greater detail somewhere else. So that's the thing about Gemara. Very often, in order to understand this line of the Gemara, I actually have to read a whole page in a different Gemara to be able to have context. So Divrei Torah, the way that Torah is presented, is that sometimes things are presented so-called in poor language, which means very briefly. Whereas if you look elsewhere, you'll find the same subject in a way of Ashirus, much more wealthy, meaning to say much more populated, much more fleshed out and explained. So therefore, Shomea or Moisif means whenever I learn something, afterwards I should say, well, where else does it speak about the subject? Because there might be a whole wealth of information that I haven't even encountered yet because it appears in a different source. And it's now my responsibility as the person who's learned to be able to go and expand on that so that I have much more information to deal with. I remember somebody once said, I don't remember who it was, but it was a brilliant insight, that the Gemara is the first hyperlinked document to exist. Because every bit of Gemara automatically crosses to either a scriptural source or another place in a different Gemara where you get more information. And so that's how we're supposed to learn Torah.
I'm asking a question. What did you say? The Gemara is the
Gemara is the first hyperlinked document. Right? Because exactly that. One phrase here opens a portal to a whole topic that is beyond what's written in this particular page. So Shomea or Moisif, the way that we're supposed to learn Torah, is with an attitude of, with an understanding that whatever we're hearing, there's a lot more where that came from, there's a lot more to unpack, and it's kind of our responsibility to go there and continue the journey. So we're, to use a cliche, not just giving a man a fish, but teaching us how to fish. In other words, that each piece of Torah that we learn is supposed to be a catalyst to a whole lot more learning that is supposed to follow. Which brings us immediately to the next phrase, same theme. Because the next phrase he says is, Haloimed almenas lelamed, that there's tremendous value if your person wants to acquire Torah, then the way that they should learn Torah is with a view to be able to teach. Now let's think about that for a moment. What does that mean practically? Every single time you sit down to learn Torah, you're supposed to be thinking, oh, I'm going to teach this to somebody else. You know what they say about rabbis? And they say many things about rabbis, but one of the things that they say about rabbis is that pulpit rabbis will never do teshuvah. Why not? Because whenever they encounter something in the Torah that is supposed to encourage somebody to do teshuvah, they think, wow, this is brilliant, I'm going to use it in my next drosha. So instead of taking it on personally, they're always focused on how I'm going to share it with somebody else. So is it not counterintuitive to say that haloimed amanas lelamed, if a person is learning in order to teach, that's going to help them acquire Torah? Maybe it's a distraction. Maybe when the person is so focused on teaching somebody else, they won't invest in learning themselves. So what do we mean over here when we say haloimed amanas lelamed? So the first thing it's teaching us, a couple of the commentaries point out, is the method by which we're supposed to learn. I always think about the difference between a university library and lahavdil, a yeshiva. A university library, the greatest sin in the world is to talk. In a yeshiva, it's a cacophony. Everybody is learning, even the people who are not learning with somebody else, even they are learning aloud. And the reason for that is because we're taught a principle. The Gemara tells us that if you verbalize, if you enunciate the words of your learning, it helps you to consolidate the information. And there's evidence of this. There's an actual link. There's a cognitive link between saying something aloud as you're learning it and retaining the information. So Haloimed Amanas Lelamed starts, first of all, with learning in such a way as if you were teaching somebody else. Before you actually teach somebody else. But just taking that approach, that the learning is not a passive experience where I just sit there and flip through the pages of a book and scan things with my eyes and see if I'm actually good at speed reading. But haloimed amanas lelamed, if the style of learning that I have is a style of teaching, that will in itself already consolidate the information in my mind. That's the first thing. The second thing is this. This is a reality check. When we know that we are responsible to share information with somebody else afterwards, naturally and subconsciously, we will focus better on learning that information because we know, our brain knows, even as I say subconsciously, that I really need to have this information clear, otherwise I'm going to flounder when I have to explain it to somebody else. So sitting down to research something, to study something, with the intention that you're going to be sharing it with somebody else, that's going to force you to actually learn this information, this material, far better than if it was just, I need to know this information. So, haloimed amanas lelamed. Now, the Gemara also says another interesting thing. It says that Hashem gave the Torah to Moshe. And Moshe was incredibly generous. So it says, Nohag bo tuv ayin. He was very generous in his use of Torah, rather than, and you're talking over here about somebody who was at the apex of human intellectual ability. Somebody who was at the apex of human spirituality. His experience of learning Torah was at a level that nobody else could appreciate. Which means this. If theoretically Moshe had dedicated the 40 years in the desert to close himself in his study and learn Torah, can you imagine what an experience he would have had? An experience of closeness to Hashem, of clarity in his learning, of consolidating information, of depth of understanding. I mean, it would have been off the charts. As it is, Moshe Rabbeinu is off the charts. He's in a category of his own, to the extent that even his siblings, who are prophets in their own right, don't begin to appreciate his greatness. And yet, Moshe was generous, and he spent the lion's share of his day, every single day, teaching the Torah to other people. And not all of those people were anywhere near his caliber. And yet that's what he did. He taught the Torah to everybody. As we always say, Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moshe taught us the Torah. Now, you might think maybe that's a poor use of resources. If you've got somebody who is that level of scholar, who has that level of connection to Hashem, who could learn Torah in such an advanced way, maybe it's a misuse of resources for him to be out there teaching. There's other people who could teach, who are not as great as he is, who are not as spiritual as he is. Let them teach. Let him be the custodian of the original pristine Torah, and let other people who have the time and have the inclination, let them be the ones to go teach everybody else. Why is it that Moshe himself teaches? So we'd walk out of here with this principle, that the ultimate objective of learning Torah is to be able to teach other people. Now we know very well what the value is of teaching other people. On a purely practical level, leave all the spirituality out of it for a moment. On a purely practical level, what happens when you teach other people? Inevitably you learn. It's an inescapable reality that when you teach somebody else, you learn. Either because people will ask questions when you teach them that you would never have thought of, and that's going to open up insight into the learning that you would never have arrived at otherwise, because the reality is we all think differently. And as long as a person is learning in their particular intellectual modality, then that's how they're going to understand everything. Whereas when you learn with other people, you get all this diverse input and perspective, which allows you the opportunity to learn things in a completely different way to how you might have done on your own. So the thing about chavrusa learning is you're not necessarily teaching somebody, right? When you're learning chavrusa with somebody else, while you have the difference of view of another person, and that's the value of chavrusa, because you're sitting across from somebody else who sees the world completely differently, and that benefits your learning. There's another value to teaching that is besides the fact that there's other opinions, and that is anybody who has experienced teaching, and we all have, because all of us teach at some point in our lives, whether it's formally or informally, whether it's to students or to our children, we're always teaching somebody. So one thing that you know about teaching is there's a cognitive process that happens when you teach that forces you to understand the material differently than when you were just learning it on your own. And that's the principle of what we call mitalmida yosem mikulam, where the Gemara talks about the fact that I learned a lot from my sages, my teachers. I learned more from my peers, my contemporaries, but I learned most from my students. Because the way Hashem has designed the human brain, it's when we get into teaching mode that's when we get our greatest clarity. Because to have to translate something from how we believe we understand it into being able to tell it to somebody else, that in itself generates internal clarity that we may not have had. And that's why there's an expression that the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, uses where he says, when you teach somebody else, your own perception and insight increases 1,000-fold. That's clarity. That's where the clarity comes from. Because having to formulate something in your mind to be able to teach somebody else forces you to actually clarify it for yourself. So the person who learns with the objective of teaching is going to have that clarity, and therefore is going to acquire Torah in a far superior way to the person who is just learning because they want to gain information and knowledge for themselves. So that's a really valuable insight. By the way, there's another practical value to teaching somebody. And any teacher will hopefully have had this experience. At some point, you meet somebody who you taught decades earlier, and they come to you and they say, I'll never forget, right? Ever hear the sentence that begins that way? I'll never forget that you once taught us X and Y, and you have absolutely no recollection of this ever happening. So based on that, some of the commentaries point out that the value of learning in order to teach is that one day your students will come back and remind you of the things that you've already forgotten that you learned and that you taught. So on a purely practical level, you're actually making an investment in the longevity of your own learning by teaching other people, which I thought was a really beautiful insight. And then the last one he says is, where a person learns Torah in order to do. Now we know that the objective of Torah is not to remain theoretical. That's useless. A person who says, all I have is Torah knowledge, but I don't have the application of the Torah into practice, we say afilu Torah ein loy. Such a person obviously does not have mastery over Torah either, because Torah was never intended to be some theoretical knowledge. It was always intended to be applied knowledge, and so therefore whatever we learn has to translate into things that we actually do in our observance of Torah mitzvahs. And therefore the ultimate way to acquire Torah is halomed amanas la'asos, where I'm learning Torah because I want to be able to actually do what Hashem expects of me. I want to be able to do Torah mitzvahs. Now, let's understand this, because there is an issue with this. Sorry, but there is a little bit of an issue. We've already learned previously about the concept of learning Torah lishma, where you learn Torah for the sake of learning Torah, which means that I don't necessarily have to have a way to apply it in my life in order for it to be considered learning Torah. I'm learning Torah for Hashem's sake. So why here are we suddenly saying that in order to acquire Torah fully, a person should be learning with the objective to be able to do? So let's try and understand this. Number one, the first thing we have to know about the human condition is, and we all know this. In fact, at this point, I'll just throw out a quick kudos to this particular crowd, because at this time of the year, when everybody's kind of, clawing their way to the summer holidays, usually what you find is that shiurim are like half the crowd, But this is a pretty consistent crowd, which is a very big accolade for the participants of the shiur. Why is it that people lose momentum along the way? When they have a shiur, why do people lose momentum along the way? And then why does it rejuvenate at the beginning of the year? What changed? Besides the fact we get tired, but what changes when we get tired? So what happens is we lose the geschmack. That's the word for it. In Hebrew, we call it the tainug. We understand the value, we understand the importance, but we're wiped out. It's been a long year. Many things have happened. There were all kinds of things that assailed our sensibilities this year. So we're feeling tired. We don't have that geschmack. We don't have that same thrill, that same enjoyment out of the learning of the Torah that we had at the beginning. Then we rest up a little bit. We have a little, and what do they say? Absence makes the heart grow fonder. So then we come back at the beginning of the year and we're very excited, and the geschmack is back. We're excited about it and we're looking forward to learning. Now, what happens is, when a person links what they're learning with things that they are doing, it helps us keep that geschmack. Because it actually impacts my life. It actually has relevance. So that helps me to stay enthusiastic about what I'm learning. And therefore, amanas lasos, if a person is learning Torah in order to be able to do something with that Torah, besides the fact that they'll pay attention because they have to know what to do, in exactly the same way as in the old days, which some people in this room may remember. There used to be a time where there was no GPS. You may remember. Could be it was before your time. But there was a time where there were no GPS, and what you had to do was you had to remember the directions. Somebody gave you directions. You actually had to remember the directions. So you paid a lot of attention because you had to remember the directions. Otherwise, you'd get lost and you'd land up somewhere else. Right? You have to remember phone numbers, exactly. But the main thing you have to remember, for this example, is that you're going to land up in the wrong place if you don't remember the directions. And the directions might have included obscure landmarks. When you get to the place with the house that's got the red roof, that's when you turn left. Things like that. So you'll pay a lot more attention if you know that you have to apply this in practice. And in the same way, halomed amanas lasos, if a person knows that I have to apply this in practice doesn't necessarily only mean I need to know how to do a mitzvah. It's I need to know how to live as a Jewish person. Whatever I am learning is supposed to translate into how I live daily as a Jewish person, not only in the context of doing a mitzvah, but in the context of everything, the way that I run a business, the way that I eat, the way that I engage socially, etc. So I'm going to pay much closer attention to the information if I know that it is relevant to my life. As long as I can convince myself that this information is purely theoretical, I can also convince myself that if I miss something, nishkeferlach, not the end of the world. But if this is my roadmap, I don't want to miss any step of the series of directions, because if I miss one step, it could land up in a very unhealthy place. So that's halomed amanas lasos. Or we could take it one step deeper. We could take it one step deeper as such. This is specific to mitzvahs. We know that in our relationship with Hashem and in the way that we serve Hashem, there are two major areas that we're supposed to focus on: Torah learning and the observance of mitzvahs. And we understand that why there are these two major areas is because there are really two types of investment that Hashem makes in our world. Now, the irony of Torah versus mitzvahs is that what on the one hand is the benefit of the one over the other, on the other hand, it's the opposite that's the benefit of the other. In other words, what I'm saying is this. The value of learning Torah is that it could really make sense to us and it could really enrich us because we understand what we're learning. And any time that we can understand something, it becomes quite personal. Whereas if you do something that you don't understand, it's very difficult to personalize it. So the advantage of Torah over mitzvahs is that Torah is very much an intellectual process where we are encouraged to understand what we're learning. And that's satisfying. Whereas mitzvahs, quite often we're told to do a mitzvah that we don't really understand. And even if we've learned something about it, we still don't really understand it. So for example, if somebody's going to tell you that you put a mezuzah on your door and it's going to protect your family, while that may be something we have seen in our own lives, we don't understand it. We don't understand how a mezuzah protects the family. We don't understand how it is that if one letter isn't exactly the way that it should be, suddenly we don't have the divine protection. We don't understand it, but we've seen it, but we don't necessarily understand it. And the other mitzvahs that we do, we for sure don't understand. Like, what's the big deal about if I wait 5.5 hours instead of 6 hours after meat before I have milk? What's the big deal about mixing meat and milk in the first place? Not to mention something as obscure as shatnez, wool and linen. So there are many things about the mitzvahs that we don't understand. So the advantage of Torah is that it becomes quite personal to us because we go through a process of study and therefore understanding and appreciation, which makes it relatable. Whereas mitzvahs, the downside of a mitzvah is that very often we're just doing this because it's what we have to do, even though we don't understand it. So, well, that's a problem if we do it robotically, right? But it can happen. Now, Torah learning, unfortunately, can also become robotic. It is possible, right? It can. I'm just saying, mitzvahs can be passionate and Torah could be robotic. That's the choices that people make. But here's the thing. If Torah is something that we can understand, that means what Hashem has done with the Torah is He's taken infinite Torah and He's calibrated it to suit finite intellect. That means that as we're understanding, so we're losing the infinity of Torah, because now we're relating to the understandable, which means the defined, which is the opposite of infinite. So it's concise, exactly. It's like the teacher, exactly. So it's like the teacher who's simplifying for the student, exactly. Mitzvahs are never tailor-made for us. They are always in their original infinite state. That's why it doesn't matter who's doing the mitzvah. It could be Moshe Rabbeinu, or could be a person who found out this morning that they're Jewish, and they do a mitzvah. It's of equal value, because the mitzvah has Hashem's infinite capacity at all times. Therefore, haloi meid al menas lasois, when a person links their Torah learning with their observance of mitzvahs, that brings into their Torah learning that infinite element that was condensed out of the learning when it was presented to us. So we now link that Torah learning to this infinite input from Hashem. And therefore, if we truly want to acquire Torah in its most perfect sense, we need to have that symbiotic relationship between what we're learning and what we're doing, so that our finite understanding is linked to Hashem's infinite will, which is expressed in His mitzvahs, and that infuses our Torah with a whole different dimension to what the human mind would be capable of accessing. And that takes Torah learning, obviously, to the ultimate state. And that's how you acquire not just information through Torah, but acquire Torah itself.
Would you say that's Chokhmah being a dime?